Check on the video. Well, we're ready to go, but I need someone. How do you feel about making sure that when we're talking, it goes to here? Are you going to speak from here or from there? All right. Yeah, this one's busy.
I was kitchen here right over here.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Thank you. No, you're good.
Unless you want to be the volunteer of the image.
I'd be happy to. Do you need help?
Well, if you'd like to, I'd really appreciate that. Because some of us are going to speak from there, some of us are going to speak from
there. Sure.
Because it's more fun.
So I'll just kind of pivot the little legs from time to time.
Good evening. Oh, you lot are much better than my students. You're actually fighting down. Okay, so hi, welcome to SFU. My name's Jen Marchbank and I'll be the moderator this evening. This event has been organised by the Morgane Oger Foundation and in partnership with my department, which is the Department of Gender, Sexuality and Women's Studies. And our head of department is over there, Lara Campbell. So, a little bit of how we're going to do this tonight, but first of all I would like to acknowledge that this room is on the lands of the Squamish, Tuatsil-Watuth and Musqueam peoples, the traditional territories of these people, and I don't think we ceded it. So we're going to go today into, I'll do some introductions, brief ones at first, and then when people come up to speak more formats, then there will be a little bit of Q&A back and forth. I have some set questions that have been written up already, and when do you want your presentations in? Or will they come in your answers?
They'll be before the answers. So you have the schedule.
Yeah. So also just given the tonight's topic, I want to just talk about a little bit about our expectations of keeping this a safe space. No one will be refused the right to ask a question, but we will ask that any questions or comments are respectful of each other and of maybe differing views in the room. Okay? I hope you'll be able to help me do that. Right, so we're introducing the topic, Exporting Hatred, is populist anti-transgender campaign being waged from Canada? So just a little bit of a preamble. Canadian activists opposed to the inclusion and equal protection of transgender persons were vocal when 10 provinces, 2 territories, and our federal government added the explicit prohibition from discrimination on the grounds of gender identity or expression to Canada's human rights laws. Despite an unequivocal failure of their efforts at home, a number have moved on to organise against inclusion overseas. Some are going as far as using disinformation campaigns to create fear and outrage overseas as they push to deny trans persons in the UK and other countries the very protections enacted in Canada. It is my distinct pleasure here today to moderate this conversation between 2 leaders in this fight for inclusion and equality and how Canada exports hatred overseas and of the consequences of these campaigns. And as someone who originates from Scotland and had a Canadian export close down the conversation and the gender recognition bill in my home country, I'm quite interested, I'm very interested in this. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Nim Ralph. And Nim is a trans activist, freelance trainer and facilitator, and as we discussed, still able to live in London. An activist and organiser in the UK for over 15 years. They have co-founded, now you might have to pick up the mic and say this one. Is this QTIPOC? QTIPOC, yeah. Thank you. It's a London network for queer, trans and intersex people of colour. Also an environmental and social justice organisation, So We Stand. This is quite a long bio because they're quite, I've done lots. They were also a founding member of the EdgeRoot Fund, a grassroots radical funding initiative. They run 2 flagship training programs for activists, organisers and change makers, Campaign Bootcamp and Movement Builders, as well as working as a campaigns and anti-oppression consultant for a number of organisations globally during Transgender Europe, Greenpeace International, Some of Us, and stand.earth. They campaign actively for queer and trans rights and organise extensively around issues related to anti-racism, disability and the environment. So I'm going to invite Nim to come and talk for 10 minutes, and then I'll introduce Morgane, and then Morgane will talk for 10 minutes, and then we'll go into the questions. And I'm going to steal your seat.
Right. Well, this will get
Oh yeah, I've never had such a long introduction.
Morgane wrote it.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I do, and I just realised I exported these slides without my slide notes, so I'm just going to waffle as I present them. I'm also not a public speaker, so I'm just going to name I'm a little bit nervous, bear with me. Just so you all know, my gender is 90s boy band, and that's really important to me. Like Jen said, I'm a trainer, facilitator for campaigners, and that's me in action. So, why are we here? This is a lovely picture of one of your favourite Canadian exports with some of our local British transphobic feminists. I am actually going to pull up my notes because I cannot remember anything I was going to say. Give me 2 seconds. Yeah. Sorry. Okay, so why I'm here, this is what I was talking about. So I actually was coming over for work, and as I was coming to Vancouver, and there were so many direct links between trans organising happening here in the UK, as well as some of the forces that we're fighting against, I thought I'd use it as an opportunity to stay on and meet with trans activists here and hear about what's happening on the ground and what strategies are working and which ones haven't worked so well. And not least, this felt important because other people are doing it. And so it felt important to strategize, to link up and to connect the dots between what's happening. So, some context about the situation in the UK. Lots of stuff really kicked off 3 years ago when the government opened up a consultation on what's called our Gender Recognition Act, which is the law which sets into stone the process by which people are allowed to legally change their gender. So this law was established in 2005. It's been there for nearly 15 years, and because it was made in 2005, it's pretty archaic. So it sets out this process that is very intrusive, it's laborious, it means that we have to have socially transitioned and prove it for 2 years, there has to have been medical intervention, we have to have psychiatric diagnoses, and we have to pay for the pleasure of that. So we compile all this evidence, pay for it to be submitted, it goes off to a panel that we don't know who sits on. They decide, have we got the right evidence or not? Are we trans enough or not? And either approve us or don't and send it back. And if they don't, because we've got one bit of evidence wrong, you have to pay for the whole process again. And that gives you something called a gender recognition certificate. And what that does is allows you to change your birth certificate. And from there, if you want to then also change your passport, driver's license, you have to pay for all those things too. So the government, a couple of years ago, decided this is quite laborious and costly, and it's not very fair. So we're going to update it, and we're going to look at kind of what's happening in other places and make this a more humane process for people. So they opened up this consultation, which they thought would get the sort of interest that government consultations normally get. Not very much. They sent it off to stakeholders, which were organisations like LGBT organisations as well as women's organisations. And that is where this all starts, because women's organisations got it, where there is it's one of the hotbeds of kind of transphobic feminist thought, and went wild. And so it kicked off this whole mobilisation of the movement. Oh yeah, something to say is that most trans people I know, in fact I don't know a single person who's got a GRC, and most trans people I know couldn't care less, if I'm honest, about the actual process behind this law, because what's happened in the meantime is the rest of society's caught up. So I can change my gender on my passport, on my driving license, at my bank without needing a GRC. So I don't need to go through that process or pay that money to get one. Less than 5,000 people have obtained a GRC since the incarnation of this law in 2005, and there's a community of something between 200 and 500,000 trans people in the UK. Less than 5,000 people have actually got it. So what this did was made trans people suddenly care, because it kicked off a culture war. And suddenly we were the topic of the mainstream media in not very nice ways very, very quickly. Okay, and so from there, what happened is organisations set themselves up, this one's called Fair Play for Women, explicitly to campaign and mobilise around against trans rights. They use really evocative imagery and really evocative language, so you can see here it's pretty awful. And most of their imagery is this kind of imagery. It's like, it generates this idea of like the trans bogeyman coming to get you. So it was an opportunity to frame the conversation around whether trans folks should be able to change their gender legally. That's the conversation they were having. Whereas the consultation opened up was about how the process for changing gender was happening. So we've had the right to change gender for nearly 15 years. But the conversation they were really successful at kicking off was, should we be able to at all? Sorry, that's my face in my notes. Yeah, and there were no actual proposals to different solutions. There was no conversation about what it would look like to do this in a different way. It was just, if trans people get rights, women are losing theirs. It was classic kind of fear tactic stuff. Generously, it's inconsistent logic. So for me to be able to access any life-saving health services, I had to sit in a room on my own with a cis white man who asked me questions about my sexual preferences, my sexual behaviours, my family history, my mental health history, etc., 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 just to get access to services. And that's what you have to go for your certificate. So if we're talking about the patriarchy intersecting with our lives, this is about erasing the patriarchy's impact in our right to access our bodily autonomy. And yet the framing was, if you get to do this at all, you're coming for us, basically. So the extent to which that this took hold is that even The Guardian, which is kind of our liberal paper, took an explicitly transphobic editorial stance, so that the US Guardian, colleagues on the US Guardian actually published public pieces saying that they wouldn't stand by the British Guardian stance on trans rights because it was so transphobic. So that's kind of the level. When I say the mainstream took this, I'm not just talking about the kind of like right-wing papers here, I'm talking about the mainstream, everybody. And it really is, it's really not taken for granted that trans women are women in the UK. Like, that is still a statement that you have to argue about, very, very much so. So they started to mobilise rapidly and effectively, and around the consultation, they got huge numbers of people to respond to it, but luckily they didn't understand the difference between a petition and a consultation. So it means that they mobilised huge numbers of people to respond, but with copy and paste answers, which basically rendered their responses pretty ineffective. But on the other hand, getting other people to fill it in was quite difficult. Because in the process of it all, I started to realise that there are many, many organisations and individuals who were coming out publicly in support of transphobic policies, but many of our allies weren't, either through fear of getting attacked or fear of saying the wrong thing. So there were a lot of people who wanted to help and get involved and just didn't know what to do and were frozen. In addition, many people weren't filling the consultation in because it was a government consultation, so it was bureaucratic. There were 23 questions. I didn't even understand most of the questions or what the different answered outcomes would lead to, and spent months trying to figure out what the answers to all the questions were. It was really hard. So, the other thing that was happening is that the messaging was really working on a platform of fear. So just a content note that this is a really horrible sign from a protest, but it was really akin to the sorts of arguments that you get about refugees and about borders and migrant rights. It was, if we create this myth and this idea of like or if we get enough stories or a couple of stories about predators who fit our kind of strawman construct about what this is, and tell that story enough, people will be scared. And that messaging was working, is working, does work, because it hits at people's fear and then moves from there. And much like we see in migrant rights debates, or not debates, but all white stuff. And you can see that the imagery here is not inconsistent. It's that same kind of application of fear. So, what we did about it is 3 days before the close of the consultation, well, that's not true, a couple of weeks before the close of the consultation, I was like, this is not working, we're not getting any responses, they're getting loads of responses, and at that point we didn't know that they were copy and paste responses. We need to mobilise and get more people to respond to it. So I basically called in some friends, asked friends of friends to help, and on no budget in 2 weeks we managed to make a video. And I worked with an organisation called Level Up, who developed a portal on their website that meant that we picked out the 3 most important questions from the petition, from the consultation, sorry, and rephrased them so that they were in plain language, and put this video out. And 3 days before the end of the consultation, and it got 80,000 views in 3 days, and we got 7,500 more responses in 3 days, which was 50% of the number that Fair Play for Women got over 2 years. So that was pretty cool. And it basically worked because it simplified the message, it simplified the action, it was timely and urgent, and it also humanized us. So the video itself was really intentionally showing us as nice humans. And it worked. Okay, where from there? Okay, so what happened next is basically Brexit. Which means that the whole process, the whole consultation, we still haven't had the official review of the consultation results. It's been on hold for months. The government will not answer.
Can they take the transphobia with them?
That would be great. They won't answer direct questions about when it's coming out. It's kind of lost into the ether at this moment, and we don't know what's going to happen with it. Also, as was mentioned in the introductions, we had a familiar face to you come over to the Scottish Parliament to lobby them around their GRA, which was very successful. So the Scottish Government announced an official delay on the bill, and then have recently announced that they're going to do a second consultation, almost directly linked to this. And it's also feeding, you might have heard that we're having an election in a couple of months all of a sudden. It's also really feeding the right. And so you can see here, number 10 has been polling culture war issues such as the transgender rights to see whether they can be weaponised against Labour and northern working class constituencies. And the whole Brexit thing shouldn't be underplayed here, because what's happening in the country politically anyway is polarisation of hard right, hard left politics. And so this whole conversation is feeding that and is fed by that very, very neatly right now, and they're happening together. So the thing is that the responses that we had on our side, it's not just that they were good at mobilising and organising, it's also that the responses on the other side weren't very effective. So Stonewall, this is Ruth Hunt, who was the CEO of Stonewall, came out with a stance that was a great stance of allyship. They said trans lives aren't up for debate. Amnesty came out with trans rights are human rights, and they were the only two really big vocal voices in the whole conversation. The problem with that is that it misread the time. So messages like, symbolic messages like this, like love is love, that worked in the equal marriages debates, work at a time when the population has broadly ceded culturally a preference for your issue. And that is not where we're at. So what I think, in my opinion, those statements did is repolarize the conversation away from us. So it repolarized the idea of trans people as different to women, and it repolarized this idea that like we're not going to join in the conversation is transphobic, so if you're fearful right now, you're transphobic. And the thing is, the problem with that is, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So right now, we are on the menu. And it's pretty shit. So I'm nearly at the end, I know I've gone on for a while, sorry. But there are other things happening. So the whole GRA thing kicked off this huge wave. They're doing other things. A parallel to Vancouver is that in the 2018 London Pride, a bunch of transphobic feminists and lesbians took over the front of the march and were allowed to lead the entire London Pride march.
Oh.
Yeah, and it completely transformed the narrative because it was presented as the queer community accepts its leadership. So they marched with these really transphobic banners. It was awful, but this year we turned up and changed it, which was really great. So we got out on the streets. We took up space. We organised loads of people. We networked. So I was marching in a block with Stonewall called the Together in Pride. So it was Para Pride, which is like disabled pride, with us as queer trans people of colour. Mermaids, which is a trans children's charity, and Stonewall, and an FTM charity as well. And we also crowdfunded to get thousands of these flyers printed, which gave an ABC of what to do if TERFs show up. So we handed them out, and people were desperate for them. It was amazing, and then waved them as flags the whole way through the march. So we just said alert people. We had a hashtag to alert people if you see them. Block them from view, because that's what they want, is the media attention, the coverage, and cold shoulder them, don't engage with them. They do call the police on trans people, that's happened regularly at events. Don't engage with them, because also the less you say, the less chance you'll say something wrong. And it was super, super effective, and actually beyond our organising, loads of people came out with trans flags, and it completely tipped the narrative from the transphobic feminism is leading this movement to hell no, it's not. Which was really amazing. And literally in 2 days, the narrative started to tip in our favour, slightly. There's still a lot of work to do. Oh yeah, the other thing to say that you might have heard of is Mermaids, the charity, the children's charity I talked about. They came for the charity, they came for their funding, they reported them to the National Lottery, which is one of the biggest funders in the UK. They had £500,000 funding from them as safeguarding risk children. National Lottery listened and froze their funding while they investigated. And in the meantime, this online gamer dude called H-Bomber something. H-Bomber guy, thank you, did a 24-hour gameathon that AOC, no less, turned up to and rang in. This is him on the phone to AOC, and raised £250,000 overnight for Mermaids, and then they also got their funding released back. So it actually increased their funding, which was great. And finally, yeah, they also turned up, they actually scored an own goal against themselves. They turned up at a Stonewall trans children's event about supporting trans children in education with these really graphic, horrific signs of post-surgery and surgery stuff with lots of really abusive language on them, and stood outside and exposed themselves for the anti-bodily autonomy right-wing movement that they are, really, because the visual is so much like the people who stand outside abortion centres with anti-choice posters that it actually was a really good own goal for us. And that was Megan Murphy's lovely friend Posey Parker. But in the last 2 weeks, what's happened is we've got this new LGB alliance that's established itself. So it's basically an anti-transgender alliance of people, many of whom have publicly said they support it, don't actually appear to be LG or B, which is the interesting thing. So it's this real utilisation of sexuality, lesbians in a community, like weaponised against us without any real context or basis. But on the flip side, we are starting to see a change. Jamila Jamil, do people know who she is here? Yeah, okay, cool. For example, was posting really, really great, awesome tweets last week in support. Emma Watson just came out and said something really publicly about it. So we're starting to get the kind of voices in the media that they've got coming out. And there are 3 hotbeds, this is relevant to the latest conversation, there are 3 hotbeds where they're really, really active. One is environmental activist spaces, one is academia, and the other is the women's sector. And the thing that unifies all 3 of them is that they have this approach, which is a commitment to a logic and a logic model that refuses to take into account the material reality of real people out here just trying to live our lives with safety and support. And maybe, if we're lucky, even a little bit of, this is them looking into the logical, a little bit of love. Yeah.
was actually in Edinburgh this summer for Pride Scotia, and every single politician who spoke about the fact they're getting the gender recognition back onto just being discussed. That was the focus. So now I'm going to introduce Morgane. Some of you might already know her. Anybody? No. Okay, so Morgane Oger. Morgane Oger is a Canadian transgender and human rights advocate. Yeah, with bells on. She lives in Vancouver where she's raising a family, and the focus of her work are inclusion and public policy. Working through the foundation, to which you can donate this evening if you would like. This is a foundation Morgane founded in order to continue her activism work. She strives to narrow the gap between Canadian human rights law and the reality faced by Canadians impacted by discrimination. Morgane has served on the City of Vancouver LGBTQ2+ Advisory Committee. She is past chair of the Trans Alliance Society, the Vancouver District Parent Advisory Society, the BC NDP SOGI Committee, and a few other things. She was also a founding member of the Law Union of British Columbia and is currently Vice President of the BC New Democratic Party. See why I have to read this? I wouldn't have remembered this. Morgane spearheaded review of the Vancouver Police Department transgender and jail policies and works to address the systemic problems caused when organisations and institutions flaunt cannabis laws. She works with the Canadian Human Rights Commission to provide support to transgender women involved in the federal prison system, going through the Federal Human Rights Tribunal process. And now, Sammy said that. Over to you, Morgane. Are you standing, sitting?
I'm gonna sit.
Okay, I'll go over there.
You hear it? I'm gonna sit because I think it's easier, and I don't have any slides to show. I just have some notes. So, thank you very much for the introduction. Nim, thank you for reaching out to me and saying, hey, let's do this. So it's all on them. I'm not a lawyer. I think this is a very important thing that I always need to make sure I tell people, and actually my lawyers tell me that I have to tell people. I'm not a lawyer, which means I'm sloppy with the law, and one shouldn't quote me in a court. But however, I'm someone who's experienced both being a successful complainant in a major human rights case on hate propaganda and hate speech, and I've got experience in 4 BC Human Rights Tribunal processes and 3 federal human rights tribunal processes as a there's something in here. Anyways, helping people go through the process. We've had a 100% success rate so far in our work with the tribunals. And mostly sadly that's been due to the fact that the institutions that we go up against, or the individuals that go against me, find themselves really not actually understanding the basis of how our legal system works. So I was also the target of an impressive amount of hatred and attacks for being transgender, and also for standing up and speaking out. Now, in honesty, everybody who's in a marginalized group and is a public person faces hatred online. It's a problem that's getting out of hand that we really need to do something about it. The polarizing nature of anonymity is a problem that is causing schism in our society. And Twitter and the social media are a real place where we see where this is happening. So in 2017, I filed a complaint with the BC Human Rights Tribunal against a man called Bill Watcott when he published some flyers urging people to discriminate against me on the basis of my gender identity. I'm calling being transgender an impossibility, or actually changing of sex an impossibility. The tribunal ruled in 2019, after 2 years, like a very horrific dogfight of 2 years, which involved 13 rulings, of which 7 have been published rulings. And the ruling was that indeed, displaying or publishing material urging people to discriminate or advertising an intention to discriminate on explicitly prohibited grounds is a violation of the Human Rights Code in Canada, therefore a violation of the law. And more importantly, the excuse of the charter right of freedom of expression or freedom of religion is not a trump card, and that was based on another ruling, which is Saskatchewan against Bill Watcott, again, same person in 2013, at the Supreme Court of Canada. So in Canada, The charter rights are not absolute, they're balanced against one another. And a right to have a free expression or faith does not trump the right to live free of discrimination. So the title of this talk is about hatred and exploiting hatred. The key factor, the question that comes up a lot is, what is hate propaganda and what is hate speech in Canada? What is this thing that we talk about all the time? We see all of us who've been on social media in the Twitter storms talking about hatred and hate speech, see people thinking they're saying something reasonable, being met with other people telling them they're being hateful or criminal. And there's a clear lack of education in Canada, a lack of understanding about where the line is of hatred. And it turns out that the line is defined and it's stated by the Supreme Court ruling in Saskatchewan against Watcott from 2013. And specifically, I have to find it because I took all 4 of the ruling points here. Supreme Court Justice Rothstein stated that the freedom of expression is central to our democracy, but not absolute. As West Coast, actually as LEAF Canada pointed out, LEAF is the Women's Education and Legal Fund. It's a national charity for legal rights of women. The Supreme Court noted, they said this, the Supreme Court noted that the freedom of expression is central to our democracy, but it's not absolute, and limitations may be justified under Section 1 of the Charter. In considering justification for the limit, the court held that the objective of the legislation is pressing and substantial. The court recognizes the harm caused by hate speech, not only to the targeted group, but also to society at large. Quote, hate speech lays the groundwork for later broad attacks on vulnerable groups, Justice Rothstein said. These attacks can range from discrimination to ostracism to segregation, deportation, violence, and in the most extreme cases, to genocide. A particularly insidious effort of hate speech is that it inhibits the expression of the targeted group, Justice Rothstein noted. So this is all well and good that we have this sentiment and that the Supreme Court says that there is hate speech, and that hate speech matters, but what is exactly hate speech? That's the question. So the Supreme Court ruling from Saskatchewan v. Watcott actually has a test for hate speech, and this is the legal test today in Canada. And this test for hate speech is whether, in the views of a reasonable person aware of the context and circumstances, the representation exposes or tends to expose any person or class of persons to detestation and vilification on the basis of prohibited grounds of discrimination. It's an objective test, targeted to extreme manifestations of hatred or contempt, and focused on the effect of the expression. And that's interesting. It's not like the test isn't based on the intention to hate someone. So this is something that comes up a lot in anti-transgender sentiment. People say, Morgane, we don't hate you, Morgane, but stay away from our kids. Right? This is a statement that comes up a lot, and this is the example of, it's not necessarily that an individual holds animus in their heart against a person because they're of a protected class. It's because the consequences of their actions cause animus in others. This is the test for hatred in Canada. Unfortunately, in June 2013, the Canadian Parliament rescinded a key protection against hatred for Canadians, which was limits on hate speech online through transmitted means. So the Federal Human Rights Code, or Federal Human Rights Act, actually applies to federally regulated industries and some contexts like indigenous law. And it had a clause that addressed hatred online or in any transmitted medium, as compared to a displayed medium. In the BC, when I went after Mr. Watcott for his actions, that was because he had displayed something. So if a physical display, or maybe a screen, like the screens here, are fall under BC law, but the transmitted material, like this podcast right now on Facebook, falls under federal law in Canada. And on June 2013, the government rescinded Section 13, which addressed hatred online. Since that date, there has been actually no control of hatred online in Canada as a whole in any transmitted medium, either for telephones, television, social media, or anything we read online in an online publication. And this is a problem because it leaves only today in Canada the criminal code to address hate speech, because unless it's done on paper, like in this sheet here, then you can't actually access civil remedy to get hate propaganda addressed. So in other words, online hatred gets transmitted, for example, to the United Kingdom using online publications that are dedicated to demonizing or pathologizing or vilifying transgender people. If those web pages had been printed to paper, they would be actionable under provincial law, but because they're printed on a screen on the display of the person summoning the image, then they are not actually actionable. Despite the fact that they can be displayed through online advertising and therefore forced on you, you're still not protected in Canada against hate propaganda. Strangely enough, we do have another measure in Canada. There is one last option, which is the criminal code. Now, the criminal code is a very dangerous animal to use because you don't have any control over the outcome of a complaint. It's not widely understood by people who aren't accustomed to the law, but if you make a complaint to the police, I've had to make a number of complaints to the police for harassment or threats, and when you do this, you file a complaint, and that's all you hear from it moving forward. The complaint is registered and it's processed, and you find out that it's going to be prosecuted if one day you're told, we need you on the stand, or we need you to come and testify. Unlike a civil case where your lawyer goes to complain before a judge, in a criminal courts in Canada, the Crown lawyers go before the judge. And once you've gotten this process started, it's not your lawyers anymore, it's not your voice anymore, which is a very difficult thing. As we know from, for example, the sexual assault criminal cases, the criminal justice system is very pernicious. It has an extremely high bar to prove bad things have happened. We have known predators that walk among us, but nobody's able to make something stick because it doesn't meet the test. Because there's prison consequences and very serious life-changing consequences from being found guilty. The test for guilty ruling is very high, and generally the test for deciding to pursue it is certainty of winning rather than likelihood of winning, and therefore it's very hard to get a hate conviction done because the police put the material to the prosecutors and the prosecutors never go forward. However, sometimes they do, and I'm going to read some of the material that has actually caused a criminal conviction in Canada for hate propaganda, and that's in the Your Word News case, which was ruled this year against James Sears and Leroy Saint-Germain, and it resulted in a year of house arrest. That's what the conviction was. Hate crime provisions under the criminal code are limited to maximum 1 year imprisonment, and incarcerating people is a very, very damaging thing that often causes even more damage, so they tend to try to put them in house arrest if possible and things like this. So as a quick background here, this is from the case law. The defendants are the editors and publishers of a community newspaper, Your Word News, which is distributed to 300,000 homes centered on the Beaches neighborhood of Toronto. It's also available online with a readership claim exceeding 1 million. They're charged under Section 319(2) of the Criminal Code with 2 counts of willful promotion of hatred against an identifiable group, Jews and women. Both defendants admitted in an agreement statement of facts that these two groups met the definition of identifiable groups. It was also admitted that Mr. Saint Germain, as publisher, is aware of the publication's contents and distribution. So the claims that resulted in the sentencing include, and here, with apologies to my Jewish friends, I'm going to read some horrific things. But basically, these are bullet points. Jews are blamed for violent acts and atrocities. And as I read these, I invite you to consider parallels in which transgender people are blamed for similar things in this list. Jews are blamed for other perceived destructive forces in society. Now, I'd like to add for each one of these, this was a header and then there was a list of examples which I didn't publish in detail. Jews are out for their own individual interests as well as global domination. Jews use hate speech law as a way to silence their detractors, but it is actually Jews that promote hatred against non-Jews. The publication denies the severity and existence of the Holocaust and accuses Jews and the state of Israel of inventing and or exaggerating the facts. Jews are behind the myth of the Holocaust. This publication celebrates Nazism in general and German dictator Hitler in particular. The publication manipulates the truth and cites seemingly scholarly sources that have been widely discredited or historical documentation out of context to support anti-Semitic assertion. These are examples I picked because each one of these examples was used in anti-trans advocacy in British Columbia and in Vancouver specifically in 2019. And I wanted to put them out there, not to diminish the experience of anti-Semitism or anti-Jewish propaganda, but to draw the important test that is very valuable. Something is hate propaganda when, if you change the subject matter, but you keep the message, it becomes hate propaganda. We have clear markers for hate propaganda that we know of, that demonize and that vilify and that pathologize people, or that associate badness with a group just because they're in a group. And that is the problem that we have in Canada today with hate propaganda and exporting hatred. And I suspect that actually a court would find that the speech that's being used to create anti-transgender sentiment in the UK actually does qualify as hate propaganda in Canada and would fall under the criminal code were a complaint to come forward, and definitely meets the standard of civil incitement of discrimination, except that our laws fall short because we don't have control of what's printed online. And that's a problem because it actually allows us to export hatred, and we can't allow that in Canada.
So what we're going to do now is move into a series of questions that we have here that both Nim and Morgane will answer. I'm going to really hold you to 10 minutes time slot so that we can get through them all and still leave time for questions from the floor. So this is a bit like, I don't know, Saturday Night Live or something. I feel like, I'm sitting at a desk asking questions and guests off to the side. Okay, so question number one, just simply, what is it like living as a trans person right now? And they go silent.
Contrast?
Yeah.
Living while trans in British Columbia, in Vancouver, is if you're not faced by intersectional struggle, in particular class, which is I would say the dominant outcome. If you have the means to take care of yourself and to demand respect, and if your family doesn't turf you when you transition and your network doesn't throw you out, you can live a healthy life in Vancouver and in Canada overall, but you cannot expect this in the more rural places in our country. We have, we see a lot of people who are who have the bad luck of living in a small town in a socially conservative area. We have a very strong conservative faith presence in some parts of Canada, and in those areas, being transgender is a high risk proposition, and coming out can really affect your life profoundly. We see that homeless youth are overrepresented in Canada. The transgender ones by far. A homeless shelter in downtown Vancouver that looks after trans youth has a instead, like they have a basically 100% overrepresentation of trans youth in their shelter as compared to non-trans youth, and they also have a 50% overrepresentation of LGBT youth as compared to non-LGBT youth. Interestingly enough, it's Covenant House, which is a Catholic charity that runs it. It's like the safest place to be trans at a youth in Vancouver is a Catholic charity. I applaud that organization for their work. But if you have skills that are not easily transferable during your transition, and if you didn't have financial buffers to allow for maybe a year or two of extreme difficulty in employment and in housing, transition is still extremely difficult in Canada overall, including in Vancouver. And you really do actually face, from what I see, it's a very real trial by fire. Some people manage to get through transition and to land on their feet, but many do not. And non-binary persons have it that much more difficult, although Canada officially recognizes 3 gender markers, male, female, and other. The other is an X here. The reality is society is far less tolerant of gender diversity than we like to think. And we still have a lot of people really facing very real employment and housing difficulties just because they're trans. And in services, it's very hit and miss. So we have a lot of services that are excellent, but we have a few service providers that discriminate where they shouldn't. I'm known for being involved in a campaign to get one of these organizations to reform, trying to get Vancouver Rape Relief to change its path and stop rejecting people on the basis of their gender identity, and instead look at policy that let them keep their programs going. But we overall, it's quite good in service providers, especially the ones that are funded, but there's a lot of room left for improvement, especially in rural areas or outside of the major metropolitan areas. And I think that's what I would say Vancouver and Canada are like if you're transgender.
I'd just like to reiterate that I work with LGBTQ youth, and being young makes it more difficult, absolutely. So over to the UK.
I think rather than repeat a lot of that, I would say it is all of that, and I think some of the differences, or there's a lot of the similarities there, and who you are as a trans person matters significantly, but fundamentally it is hard. It is really hard, and I think part of that is that like the UK is incredibly socially conservative, generally as the norm, and like I said, with Brexit and everything else going on, we've got hard right government after hard right government. We've got huge growth and mobilisation in the far right, and so there's this whole kind of political context there that lays the groundwork for this. And on top of that, there are things like we don't have non-binary gender markers recognised. Even things like going around Vancouver, I've been pleasantly surprised how many spaces have gender-neutral bathrooms. And even most cafes and restaurants in the UK, if it's a single cubicle, it will still gender it. And that's really normal. So like even down to just that daily experience of walking into spaces. And I think we're at least kind of 15 years behind in terms of women's sector services, and that has a huge impact. So there are very few trans-inclusive women's services, domestic violence, sexual violence services. And what that means is not only are there no support services, despite all of the disproportionate representation of trans people in need for those services, it also means that the people who are seen as the kind of forefront of the conversation don't agree with us having access to services. And so it means that kind of where we're starting is just really hard. And I mean, that we're talking about trans rights, but that also goes for sex worker rights because they tend to go hand in hand. And so the narrative and the conversation around sex workers' rights in the UK is as regressive and as oppressive as it is for trans rights. And I don't think you can be trans inclusive unless you're sex worker inclusive. It's just not possible. And it's much worse for my trans women friends, my trans femme friends. Most of our kind of public trans figures are trans women or trans femmes, and the amount of hate that they receive on the daily is phenomenal. It's incredible. And I think that what we also then see on top of this is that the accepted story about trans people, which is a very public one, is either that we're awful, we're a threat, we're scary, etc., or it's tragic. And so the other problem, particularly for trans young people, is that the only stories they see about themselves in the press are we're monsters or we die, or both. And there is no trans joy, there is no representation of like healthy, successful trans lives, and even the people who are publicly looking successful very publicly have to deal with this hatred on the daily. And so it's difficult on a number of levels, from the very material to the very psychological.
Thank you, even under time. On that note, if you are looking for gender inclusive washrooms on this floor, you go that way. If you go that way, you see a list of 4 things you can do in a women's washroom and only 2 you can do in a man's. As Nim and I found out when we went to look. Okay, so moving on to the next question. I'd like you to see if you would speak to what is it that people who are opposed to transgender inclusion and transgender equality, what are the things that they're actually doing? Basically, know our enemy. So which one of you would like to address that first?
Yeah, so something that I didn't say in the presentation is talking to the relationship and the strategizing that's happening between UK and Canada. So something that really struck me when this wave of mobilization happened in the UK is that British transphobic feminists were talking to Canadian and US counterparts, and were learning from strategies and approaches that didn't work, particularly 15 years ago around women's services, what messaging did work, what messaging didn't work, and they were evolving it. And they've continued to very strategically evolve that narrative at each hurdle as we've gone through the last few years. So it started with the GRA consultation, and it very quickly evolved into this story of we support gender class spaces, we just don't support sex class spaces. And so they really kind of fine-tuned this narrative over kind of 18 months that I've now seen Meghan Murphy using to great success with her audiences here. So it's kind of like this export-import thing that's happening around the strategy. And the other areas that they're being very successful is they're really targeting areas they realise they can win in. So they're being very successful around prisons and very successful around sports. And it's going pretty much undetected, particularly around prisons, because incarcerated people are kind of not held in the same regard as other members of society, and so people are really not paying attention to what's happening. But they've actually regressed quite a lot of prison policy in order to hurt trans prisoners, but that's actually being regressive for lots of other incarcerated people as well. What else do we see? I think what really struck me, we actually went to Megan's talk on the weekend, which was interesting. But what really struck me is the framing in rhetoric of victimhood, and I think that is so singularly, it's one single story that is told in the UK and is being told here. And when Morgane actually pressed in the Q&A for, okay, we get it, we're horrible people, but let's talk about the policy, what are we actually going to do about it? What are you actually proposing? The answer was more rhetoric. It was more, everything I talk about is policy, this is all about policy. Okay, what's the policy? Yes, women and girls have a right to be protected, let's talk about it. What does that mean? And there's very little substance behind that, because when you actually start to unpack that, what you realise is really you expose that what's really being talked about is let's exclude trans people. That's what the policy is. So yeah, that's my answer.
So in Canada, we also deal with the religious-based narrative, which is quite strong here. I don't think it's as strong in the UK. Am I correct?
It's not as strong vocally, but in policy it's been quite significant. So another legal, another thing that interacts with the laws around transition is our so-called equal marriage law, which was won at the expense of trans people as well as other marginalised queer people. So in there, as a appeasement of the church of the state, is something called that we call the spousal veto, which means that for a trans person who is married to transition, to legally transition, they have to get the approval of their spouse. But if they don't get the approval of their spouse, they're not allowed to use that as grounds for speedy divorce, so they still then have to file for divorce, and their spouse can deny the divorce. So it basically gives a trans person's spouse the right to deny them transition. And also it's called equal marriage, but the other thing about this law is it has a quadruple lock protection against the churches of England and Wales, which are the state churches of ever having to perform a gay marriage. There's only 2 countries in the world that automatically give religious bodies seats on the legislature, England and Iran, and where trans people are recognised. And so, like, it's not just like any church, the church of the state is protected legally against having performed gay marriage, and yet we call it equal marriage law.
Words are fascinating. So in Canada, and particularly in British Columbia, we've just had an election, and in this election, there's a new party. I consider an extreme right populist party called the People's Party of Canada. They ran candidates that ran on transphobic platforms and homophobic platforms as well. It was interesting because they ran on an anti-SOGI platform, sexual orientation and gender identity, but actually the buttons they were pressing were fears of trans people. It was interesting to see because the lead up to this election took about 2.5 years, and it was a steady drum of anti-trans sentiment, and in order to create a populist fear, and the messaging was the same. The messaging that anti-trans activists use with feminist excuse is we need to create spaces for women and girls that protect us from predators. Trans women are men, men are predator, trans women are predator. That's basically the story. In the anti-trans Christian narrative is we need to protect the family and children from predators. Trans women and men disguised as trans women are predators, and we need to stop them from transing our children. They came up with the word transing, and it's and so on the one hand, it's the boogeyman is going to go into the women's spaces and undo feminism, and then on the other hand, the boogeyman is going to steal our children and put hormones into the water. Actually claimed in an election, in the municipal election, in the school board election, was that trans people were putting hormones in the water. Nonetheless,
they know how expensive they are.
Or testosterone. Here we go. Yet, like you say, this is, you can really see how about it's a populist extreme right kind of narrative, because the definition of that kind of a narrative is that you attack people rather than attack ideas, right? And no, but in the years that I've been here, I found myself, meeting face to face with those that would meet me, including religious anti-trans activists and some feminist narrative anti-trans activists, and I would over and over suggest, let's talk about institutional policies that keep people safe with dignity. And the other answer is, boogeyman, right? Over and over again. Whereas, as I mentioned in my intro, I work with people in the prisons
to be in a Canadian federal prison, you have to have a serious sentence. And I've worked with people, with sentences between 5 and life. Trans women and trans men. It's fascinating because they have a really hard time, an exceptionally difficult time. And oddly enough, mostly it has to do with policing of gender. Ultimately, when you take it down to the bottom, it's like, you're not performing gender enough. And then they're held up against that. And I do appreciate that. Absolutely, I absolutely support security reviews for anybody who asks to change prisons. Absolutely. I have no comment on the value or the quality of their security reviews that they do. They seem very harsh, but the people that I've seen go through these reviews have good reason to go through those reviews, and it's absolutely necessary that we keep incarcerated people safe from one another and safe from the guards, and that's why we have policy. Real policy. It looks like the Canadian federal prisons are reviewing their policies. There's no doubt that maybe an unfettered hall pass is going too far. The provincial prison system here has rolled back, it seems, quietly rolled back their trans inclusion policies. Maybe that's going too far as well, and actually they've had some horrific incidents of violence against trans people in the men's prisons. Because of that, it's hard to tell where the line is in policy, but having open and clear policy is a good way to go. We do this for home, for emergency shelter today, right? A person comes off the street who needs shelter. We evaluate whether they're suitable for high barrier, high levels of functioning housing, or low barrier, low level functioning housing, and then there's consequences if you don't live up to that. We need to talk about policy rather than about people and identities, because it's actually against the law, right? As we've sorted out in Canada, and it looks like in the UK it's pretty much against the law too.
I'm going to let you carry on because you've moved on to my next question.
Excellent.
Which is really about what are being said about policies.
Sorry, I forgot about this. Okay. You've mentioned already that we need to have policies, and then when you press for those policies, that there's nothing there but rhetoric. I'm just like to invite you to say a little bit more about that, if you can.
Yeah. I want to respond to something Morgane said first, and then I'll come on to that, which is that it was interesting that you were talking about the framing of the religious groups around women and children, because that is fundamentally the framing that transphobic feminists are using in the UK to great success. It's women and children need to be protected, and it directly links to what I was talking about in kind of like migration debates. It's the idea that women and children are the people that need to be protected, and these scary predators coming for them. And of course, in that framing, it's trans women that they're talking about. So it's trans women as these scary predators that are coming for them. Trans men and non-binary people are conveniently left out of the conversation because our existence undermines all the logic of that argument. Although that said, in the UK that's starting to morph. So we are starting to see some really vitriolic sentiment towards trans men. There's been a couple of notable public trans male pregnancies in the last year, and people like Posey Parker posted online calling for safeguarding of the babies and saying that these people are like psychiatric people with mental health problems, you shouldn't be able to look after children. And so we're starting to see the kind of mask slip around that stuff, and the carefulness around talking about trans men starting to change. But that also leads into prisons, and so last year there was this very public case of a trans woman called Karen White who was in a women's prison and abused other women, which they jumped on in that kind of boogeyman kind of way of this fits our story. So they retell that story over and over and over again. And actually hashtag abolish prisons, let me just put my politics out there. But stepping away from that conversation for a moment, like what the issue was a question of safeguarding, as you're saying. Like there was a question of safeguarding any person who went into that space. That wasn't done. There was no safeguarding done, and that's what the conversation should have been. But it was jumped on, weaponized, turned into a kind of opportunity by trans folks to tell this big story about or reinforce their own story about trans women. So from there, the question was,
you were speaking earlier about when you ask for policies, you say, yes, okay, we agree with this. And then you just get rhetoric. I'm wondering, what kind of policies do you think that they could come up with, or don't you think they're able to come up with any?
Yeah, I think that the fundamental reason that they won't engage in that conversation is that, at least in the UK, they won't publicly say trans women are not women. They will only say men want to come into this space as a sexual threat. And so the problem with getting them to actually talk about a policy is that as soon as they say we should say women something, 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 we're like, great, women something, 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 because we mean trans women too. And that's why it's so hard to nail them down, I think, on policy a lot of the time. I think, like, they're right sometimes, or I'm not saying they're right necessarily in a specific example, but sometimes rights do conflict, and we should have those conversations. It's just not really the conversation that they want to have. And as soon as you start getting into the kind of hard line exactly like that of like, what's the solution to this problem, unless you are working from the same assumption of trans people deserve a baseline of human dignity and human rights, it's incompatible, and they don't want to say that out loud, so they don't get to the policy part of things. Yeah.
So policy, I think that there's definitely a conflict between the desire to not enforce patriarchal stereotypes into policy on the one hand, so to talk about, people who show abusive conduct towards other people will have this consequence, for example, would be non-patriarchal as compared to we have to protect women and girls from men. But there's also, of course, the conflict of the reality, which is that in our society, for whatever reasons, it is men primarily who do this violence. And so it makes for a very convenient shorthand to name the problem, because the problem is real, actually. Now, if you have context of, let's talk about housing policy, for example. Housing policies for an organization that takes a group, and a demographic, and for this we have to be careful that there's going to be, children are protected, that vulnerable people are protected, and we also have to be careful not to impact dignity unnecessarily, and we want to be also careful that we don't open up a situation that could easily have been avoided. Things, for example, like in the jail manual in the Vancouver Police Department, the compromise what we came up with was a trans person would automatically be put in a single person facility unless there was agreement by everybody that this person would not go there. And then they would go into multi-person. This is in a system where you're not expected to spend more than a few hours. Anyhow, it's not a multi-day experience. You could easily have, for example, policies that say that all of the facilities that get built in a way that accommodates the possibility that actually sexual assault is a risk, no matter what gendered space we're in, because the truth is it is, anyhow. Even though, yeah, for sure, there's more risk of sexual assault where men are around, for whatever reason, but they're still not zero, and it was never not zero, it was always not zero, but the patriarchal assumptions created that, the illusion that gender spaces for women, for example, are free of sexual assault, whereas us in the queer community, we know that this is not true. We know that it's about privilege and power, and not about just biology, that there are all kinds of other factors in play. But at a societal level, we haven't gotten there. I think these policy steps have to be done. But at the same time, we have to be careful not to erase the hard work that's been done. I think, there's a value to a women's center or a women's political group or something like this, and that a group gets to define what it is a valid thing. but maybe when it comes to service providers and such things, then we have to have more harsh, more clear and harsh rules, because, we used to have, it used to be tolerable to discriminate on race where we live here in Vancouver, and it no longer is. And in the same way, gender identity, for example, is emerging to be one of these explicit prohibitions from discrimination in services, and as a matter of fact, it's enforced. The policies. It's possible to write policies that work and leave people in dignity, and the example of this is everywhere in British Columbia and in Canada, where emergency housing, where hospitals, where all of our facilities that are provided to the public are able to do it without discrimination on the basis of gender identity. We still segregate by sex. Sex in Canada is taken to mean gender. There's been a conflation that's probably unresolvable forever. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know if it's good or bad. It was good for me to be able to conflate sex and gender in order to change my gender markers. That was really handy. But it's hard to tell if it's a good or bad thing. Maybe we'll let a doctorate student take care of that question. But what we need is policy, right? Or policy proposals from people who have concerns, because if all you get is hatred, it's really easy to shut down sentiment. When people say trans women or men, you're literally talking to a shiny wall in any institutional decision-making body, anywhere, in Canada, in Europe. The European Court of Human Rights has issued 2 condemnations of the UK for their policies already. They've been ordered to upgrade their laws. They can do it willingly, they can be made to do it. And that's not the road. The road ahead is to actually come up with policy proposals and then talk about that.
And then there was Brexit. So I doubt there was that's one of the reasons why some Brits want to leave the European Union, being told that their laws aren't good enough.
Well, they say about bodies.
Let's ask the Irish to decide what to do.
Works for me. Now, you mentioned something about representation. Often young people only see the tragic story.
Yeah.
So I'm going to change the narrative a little bit here and invite you both to talk about where you see things are getting better, what signs are there of things improving?
I think I'm here. Both alive and here talking to trans activists. I think part of, I talked about the 2 main messages coming out of Amnesty International and Stonewall. And part of the reason that our response was also quite ineffective is that there hasn't been a lot of trans and queer political organising. So there's loads of trans activists, but we tend to be in other movements, doing other things, housing, environment, lots of this stuff. And so there wasn't a groundswell or groups of people already organised a network to kind of collaborate and get together. And on top of that, then what happens when you get this kind of attack from society and that message is all around you is that, like, most of our people are terrified, traumatized, facing increased violence on the street, and concerned with survival. And that doesn't bode for moments to stop and pause and think about, oh, what's our campaign strategy right now? How do we change an entire population's conversation about us? So that's been really hard. I'm just contextualizing before I get to the good stuff. But jumping ahead to the good stuff is that I think we're now at a point where people are like, okay, we've had enough. We're ready to fight back and we're ready to look at what this means. So people are starting to get more organized. People are starting to come together and talk about it more. Lots of the people that I've walked into rooms with and said, where's your trans message right now? Like, where's your trans solidarity right now? Or your trans message is hurting us. They're just like, oh my God, tell us what to say, we'll say it, tell us. And they really want it. And I'm not the king of all trans people. I can't be your single solution right now. But I think that there is a real thirst to be able to say the right thing and a willingness to say it and get over the fear of saying the wrong thing so we're not saying anything. And so examples like Jamila Jamil saying something so articulate and public the other day, I think gives people a sense of hope. And I'm not all about celebrity endorsements, but in the context where all of the public narrative has been transphobic, it does matter, and it matters for things like young people being able to see that people have their backs. I have spent 2 weeks meeting with some really awesome trans activists, getting loads of information about different tactics and strategies and some of the pitfalls that people have fallen into here, as well as like some of the stuff that's gone really well. And I'm taking that home. That feels really hopeful. We're going to start organising some stuff. And I think that, like I said, I kind of answered some of this question already, that there have been some things like some own goals. So Posey Parker is now very distant from the rest of the movement. A lot of them have put a distance between themselves and her because of things like that action outside Stonewall. And also she's one of the few people online who publicly will say things like, we have to say him for trans women because if we concede anything, we lose everything. And so her being so visible and honest about her politics means that lots of other people are distancing themselves from her because, I mean, there's pros and cons there because it means that they're still hiding behind the rhetoric, but that's happening. And the queer community is really behind us now, and very visibly and vocally behind us. So lots of LGBT, queer people are really out on the streets, and like we saw at London Pride, there was like a huge trans takeover, and that really shifted conversation. So there is hope. Who knows what happens if Brexit happens? We might have Corbyn as a leader, and Corbyn, it was interesting, I had a conversation with Corbyn's office, and 2 weeks later he put out a public statement, and that's all it took. And so he's on side. If he gets elected, things could completely radically change. If he doesn't, who knows who our Prime Minister will be, who knows. I mean, we won't leave the European Court of Justice as a different body than the EU. So human rights law will still have to stand, at least for a short time. And Brexit's going to take 20 years. This is
Not that the people who voted for Brexit understand that.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people are like, oh, if we just get Brexit over and done with, it'll be done, it'll take a year, we just vote yes. It's going to take 20 years, so.
100.
100. There we go, 100 years.
So how are things getting better? They're getting better in a lot of ways. You know, in the 90s, there was an outrage about LGBT books in the Metro Vancouver libraries in Surrey, where you live, right? There were attempts to repeat that against trans people. They have failed completely. Transgender people in British Columbia, we have our own health authority that is provincial. It's at the same level as the cancer authority for healthcare, and it was put together with a case study on financial benefit, and it was and it's a raving success. We're opening a trans surgical center in Vancouver. Well, it's been opened, so it's just starting its surgeries to provide bottom surgeries here. At the human rights side, of course, well, we've got explicit protection from discrimination on the basis of gender identity or expression, and I did some work for that, and I'm very proud to say that the first win of that in British Columbia was an all-girls school who I had coached on how to use it to their advantage, and the girls convinced their headmaster or mistress, whatever it's called, to that they would face a human rights case if they kept on forcing them in skirts. And so they got out of kilts and they were allowed to wear pants, which was a big bone of contention for the rich girls. And so, it's that's a good thing, right? And I'm kind of happy about that all this fighting we did turned out to also help the cis people. It's still good. If you don't have them on side, if you don't have the grandmothers hitting the pots, you're not going to win a fight. And so we got the grandmothers and we got the church groups to write letters, and we got people from all around the province to act in benefit in support of trans rights. I mean, White Spot wrote a letter of support for trans rights. Okay, it was good and solid groundwork there. But I would say the biggest indicator right now that I see that things are better here is there are 60 public school districts in British Columbia, and all 60 public school districts in British Columbia have a SOGI liaison whose role it is to keep the queer kids safe.
What's SOGI, Morgane?
SOGI is sexual orientation, gender identity. It's the way out here that we say LGBTQ2+, to avoid having to start to say LGBTQRST, because the alphabet salad is such a mess, and so SOGI is nice and abstract, and you don't have to keep on adding them. The federal government was the first one to do this, and people have, that's one of the ways that we talk about queer communities here. Protecting trans and gay and lesbian and two-spirit and bi and all the other queer youth in our schools, I think, is the big win. And that we're protecting them all, and we're using the same policies to protect them all, because whether it's sexual orientation, whether it's gender identity, whether you're trans for a little while and then decide, you know what, I'm not trans, I'm just gay or queer or whatever, great. Figure yourself out. It's proving that it's working. And what I really like about this is that British Columbia has these, when you have the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Health on side for a major province, and there are other provinces doing this as well, then you've already won, right? We're teaching anti-oppression and inclusion and normalization of LGBT lives to preschoolers and to kindergartners. And these kids are now starting to be, 10, 12, 14 years old, and being homophobic or transphobic or justifying an anti-trans position. I mean, you get an eye roll, please, Mom, right? And that's how it's going to be. We may have to wait for the older generation to die of natural old age before finally we're rid of anti-queer sentiment, just like it's going to take that to get rid of a lot of racism and things like this. Notwithstanding a groundswell of extreme right populist hatred that we see coming after all of us, for however we're vulnerable, that's happening, and we have to manage that. But we're seeing really good progress, that people are just becoming more accepting, and they're, rather than talking about the monster around the corner, now it's like, well, what's the big deal? And I think this is what's really good to see, because essentially the way I see it, all we have to do now is wait and let the machine take care of the rest. And you're going to have data. If for some awful, an awful twist of fate causes the UK not to move forward, then in 5 years and in 10 years, you will have reams of government-sourced data from other modern democracies demonstrating that you went the wrong way. And no government can withstand that for too many years. So I think the worst thing that can happen really is time. And maybe we'll have people with initiative demand to be represented and heard and freed. So demand some more. I'm talking to that little thing over there.
And SOGI is also a set of educational resources for teachers and that are available if people want to bring.
Yeah, there's a website, sogieducation.org, I think.
Yes.
SOGIeducation.org is the resource set.
So the provincial government commissioned the ARC Foundation to create a set of resources. I'm being very careful with my language, because those who would argue against us insist out the valley that this is a mandatory curriculum to trans your kid, or more specifically your grandkid or great-grandkid, because given the demographic that pitches up to those meetings. Okay, last question. You ended on a very positive note there. What's your call for action?
Well, I've seen people get angry and, say angry things on signs. And I've seen people meticulously and methodically go and do policy work. And in my experience, holding up a sign and waving a sign at someone whose points of view you hate often makes you look like you're hating them, and often the signs are hateful. You know, today I was speaking to the human rights folks, sorry, the hate crimes folks at Vancouver Police, and we were debating whether that guillotine sign that was at the Megan Murphy event, whether that was you know, a threat, or whether that was
That's art.
art. Well, art, and it's hard to, you know, and it's right on the edge, that one, right on the edge of like threatening people with violence.
Oh my
Versus
Expression.
expression. And it's interesting because I bet that the person who made it experienced that very differently than the person who saw themselves targeted by it. My experience is I have never accomplished anything by going to rallies except get the news, right? You get the news with the rallies, and that's valuable. We use the rallies a lot going into Chilliwack to go and deal with a very socially conservative anti-LGBT school trustee there that we didn't like what he said, and he was going after young trans kids in his under his watch. But that's nowhere near as effective as bringing in a policy that would make him fired if he said homophobic or transphobic things at the table when he was talking in his role. So my take is get organized and work the policy, which means make connections to politicians, make connections to decision makers, send people for training, get training, access training on how to get the change done. And make friends. I went to a lot of barbecues to evangelical Christian groups, and it was fascinating because that paid in droves. It's called paying in droves. There's a word for it. It really paid off, right? To go to groups which you assume are not your friends, to try to convince them to be more like your friends, and to discover that actually you have a 70 or 80, maybe 90% overlap in values, and that 10% you can talk through. That went a long ways to getting the policy changes that we were looking for out here, and I think that that's the way forward, or the way forward that affects the most people per hour of engagement per activist, and eventually it gets people like you into positions of power, and those people make decisions, and then that's even better.
I think the thing I would say first of all is do what you can from where you are. So I think often when we have these call to actions, it's like do this big thing, turn out and do this thing, but actually you can make such a profound difference from where you are. So if you work somewhere that has bathrooms, do something about them. If you work somewhere that provides services, can you at least neutralize them, if not create gender affirming services when you're there? I went to my first trans swim on the weekend. It was amazing. I've never been in a space like it, and just knowing that that exists, and that for 2 hours of a week a service thought that we were worthy of that space was transformational. If you work in a shop, think about how you're gendering the clothes. Like, think about the things that you can do in the spaces that you're in with the power and resources that you have. Also, hire trans people. We need jobs. Lots of trans people need jobs. And support trans businesses. So I went to a really great trans barbershop while I was here. And there's trans folks out there doing innovative, awesome things all the time. Seek them out to support them. Also support sex workers. So you're not supporting trans people if you're not vocally out there supporting sex workers. And we need people to be vocal about support. Like, without vocalizing support, we end up with what we've got in the UK at the moment, which is the only vocal people being vocal about hatred. Also, donate to trans community, to sex workers, donate to people's crowdfunders for healthcare services, to live their lives, because we don't have statistically the same access to income and resources that other people do. Seek out fundraisers, crowdfunders, particularly in the US where there is no public healthcare. But even then, I didn't access surgery through public healthcare because the process is so invasive and humiliating. And so seek out how you can support people financially if you have the means to. And I think turn out to, this is where we differ slightly, turn out to trans people's actions, support people on the streets where you can and where you have the ability to. It's so much riskier and more dangerous for trans people to be the people on the street, literally putting our bodies on the line for our survival. So turn out and support. And I would say more than that, like also check yourself when you're doing it also. Like don't do all that stuff because it makes you feel better, which is often, like I work with organisations to address anti-oppression, power and privilege stuff all the time. And there's net good when people do it because it makes them feel good about themselves. But you can really tell the difference when people are doing it because it's actually people who really just hate us. It's not worth it for anybody. But there's so many people, I would say arguably many more people who are fearful from the messaging, who connect to that fear, and who don't understand how the two things can coexist. And the more of you who have those difficult conversations and don't just say, you're just transphobic and I'm going to shut this conversation down, the less of that we have to do, and the less of that we have to perform our humanity for people. And I think that, like, for trans people, one of the biggest barriers is we're such a small number of people, just like in the population, that the single thing that changes people's minds about us most is seeing our humanity. But most people don't know, or don't know that they know trans people, or that they meet trans people. We can't perform our humanity for everybody. So the more of the leaning into those conversations you do, the further we'll get. Also, I'm just going to put it out there that part of this transatlantic alliance of anti-trans sentiment is that they jump on each other's bandwagons all the time on Twitter and on the internet. You'll see it's like a 24-hour machine because it's across time zones that is constantly pumping out hatred. If you can jump on and support some UK trans people on the internet every once in a while, it will make all the difference to real people fighting for real lives. So please utilise the internet.
Thank you both very much. Now we're getting into, I was about to do that. Okay, so now that I get to be the human mic holder, and as I wander around the room, I've got strict instructions that you are allowed a 1 minute to ask a question, and you'll be allowed a 30-second follow-up. Ooh, I see Lisa first. Yes?
Thank you for, to the two of you. So not to dampen your enthusiasm and your optimism, first of all, in the UK, you're saying that the LGBT people are really rallying up behind trans. But I'm seeing a lot of articles, just to see one is enough, but I'm seeing more than one, of what I would call the elite gay and lesbian folk who are beginning to say it's time for the trans community to stand on their own and to leave us, and basically throwing us under the bus. And their arguments are, we've fought hard for same-sex marriage and equality and all that, but now the trans community is really becoming we're a liability. So how do you respond? And because I see that as an ideology that is being transferred from the United States to Canada to UK and all over the world. And basically, trans people it's a very eugenic sort of view of looking at the trans community. I was wondering if you'd like to respond to that.
Well, from the organizing point of view, there was a focus on the family, I think. Came up with a white paper to shut down trans access to in schools in I want to say 3 years ago, and they had the white paper had basically a strategy that was done, and it was to shut down trans let's say contagion in society, and then the first place they picked was schools, and it was to these measures of organizing into other English-speaking countries, the measures of working together, collaborating, coordinating initiatives were in there, and so yeah, we see this, and it's planned and it's well oiled. You know, when Carrie Simpson, for example, does her anti-trans and anti-LGBT stuff, she's working a machine, and there's no doubt that it's a well orchestrated, social conservative, faith-based machine in her case that's doing this and that's coordinating elsewhere. We have to be very careful because what I notice is, of course, these groups are, they have a common opposition that they work on together, but they also dampen each other's other issues. Specifically, when the Heritage Foundation organized this event in Washington D.C., which brought together faith, social conservative, and conservative feminism together against transness. They, this was, if I'm not wrong, 3 months before the first abortion law clamped down in the U.S. And I would be fascinated to know if the interest in working together to fight on trans rights dampened the opposition to that behavior by natural enemies, right? Because that's how you make people make difficult choices, and you find something to work together on, and then you use their fear of your walking away to get them not to talk against your other initiatives. I'd be fascinated to see if actually collaborating on trans rights, which is what they're doing today, is the actual point of the collaboration between religious conservatism and conservative feminism today, and if it wasn't actually the abortion issue, which seems to be actually the one that is getting traction just underneath the radar. I think that we have to be very careful as people engage in society with something to lose when we see things like this happening and we see these coordinated attempts.
I think you're right. I think that is happening, and I think like equal marriage in the UK is where that happened most significantly, that trans people were completely thrown under the bus for the white, middle class, heteronormative elites. And not only trans people, but migrant, LGBTQ plus people, etc., like sex workers, lots of people were thrown under the bus in service of their rights. And I think in the UK context right now around trans rights, it's clear that they're the margin within the community, and that the community has really come out and said, like, those marginal voices don't represent us. There are some notable lesbians who are part of the kind of big transphobic feminist wave who get put at the front of that conversation regularly to use their sexuality as an argument against us, particularly trans women again. That's just a statement, really. It's not an answer, but it's. I agree with you. It's there. I think it's the one area that I'm seeing open in the UK. Yeah.
I'm beginning to think my identity is the bus. So, lesbians are thrown under the bus by rich white women. People of color have always been thrown under the bus, and I would not get involved in thinking some kind of war between what you think is so-called gay and lesbian movements, whatever these elites are calling themselves, and the trans movement. It's just a red herring about class. But I did want to ask you too, what about class and trans people? And Nim, what about the Labour Party in Britain? How has this reacted? What about the NDP here? And please tell me that my hero, the member from Paisley and Renfrewshire South, the incredible Maury Black, has been helping you with this.
She has a group of people who gets power in the space and how that's accountable. I think or at least in London at the moment, I think that we have a good relationship between most of the trans people who are kind of being propped up as the visible trans spokespeople of the community and accountability with the community, and that tends to work quite well. But I think that you have to have a lot of community conversations about that stuff, or it runs away from you and tears you apart, which is always in service of what people want, or the other side want. But yeah, absolutely, this is an issue of class. Everything is. Yeah.
How have the unions responded in Britain to this issue?
I'm being recorded right now.
Okay, I'll talk later.
They have a lot of money and don't do a lot of action. The unions that aren't really very effective in the UK, I would say, so Labour has taken an explicit trans-inclusive stance around their women's list, for example. So there were a lot of transphobic feminists in the Labour movement, Labour Party, sorry, rather than Labour movement, you use that term differently here. And they have women-only lists in order to balance for women representation in the membership. There was a big standoff and a fight about it, and the party came down and said, absolutely not, these lists are trans-inclusive, and a lot of them left and joined the Green Party. So the Green Party currently has a whole big problem with transphobic feminism. Interestingly though, it's the Conservatives who opened up the GRA consultation, and there's a kind of socially progressive conservatism wing of the Conservative Party that that was kind of particularly big under David Cameron. That was his whole thing, like, we're nice people. And I mean, I won't bore you with this, but I think that that's connected to the industrial economy, the industrial international economy and the global economy moving from an industrial economy to an information economy, which means that you talked about eugenics, but like the eugenic founding of principle of the economy based on our bodies and what labour our bodies can produce has become less relevant to the global north economies because they're trading in information now, not labour, and more relevant to global south economies, which are based more on industrial labour, which means that the global north, or particularly the UK, and the colonial powers, let's just call it what it is, the colonial powers get to use this narrative of like, we're socially progressive now, we like gay rights, we like trans people, because our bodies are no longer needed to be withheld from reproduction, withheld from labour because we can't reproduce, etc., and then also use that to weaponise against industrial economies and call them homophobic for the laws that the colonisers left behind. And it's like just this cycle that feeds itself that is inherently linked to class, empire, colonisation, etc.
So I'm not in a union, but Labour in Canada has been at the forefront of trans rights, and I hope UK Labour will follow the example of Canadian Labour. They helped really plow the institutional road when it comes to giving voice to trans people and non-binary people and women, and that tradition hasn't stopped in any way. Class on its own it's a cruel mistress, like we all know. It's an awful thing, right? If you don't have the financial means here to withstand the negative hit on your ability to earn money, the consequences are severe, and you really see this with young trans people who just cannot find work, or cannot find work that pays at a reasonable wage. For all the safety nets that we try to put together as a society, we still find ourselves excluding people because of identity documents or because of all kinds of problems that we put in the way that stop trans people from accessing services or jobs because they're trans. There has been some efforts put out here to address that by helping people who can't afford identity document changes access them. Here, the name change is very expensive, and the gender marker change is very inexpensive, and that's been a real problem for a lot of people. And yeah, the binary, here we have indigenous people, of course, right, which which have a much broader understanding of gender, and the colonialization of North America devastated those communities, and people who didn't fall in the binary that much more. We're only just now starting to address the consequences of this, the genocide that we had here, which was a very, very long-lasting one. It's very hard to undo this kind of damage in a single generation, and we have a long ways to go, I think. But at least we're starting, I guess. This basically is the only thing you can say is it's better today than in 20 years. But it's a shame. It's so shameful that it's taken this long.
And we're running out of time, so we're going to take the two last questions here together so that you could answer them together.
I don't know if I had much of a question. I had more of a statement. I'm with the Coalition Against Trans Antagonism. We're local shit disturbers who aren't bound by the colonial government, who want to acknowledge the territory that we're on, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, who have never ceded these lands to any colonizers who've come here. Although in the mix of colonization is pretty complicated at this point, it's easy to say. I think that, like, for me, I've learned to adapt quite recently. I mean, I have for quite a long time. I've been organizing in the community for a couple of decades now, in the trans community particularly. And I've adapted in probably the past 10 years, but specifically the past 5 years, to do more direct action and less asking for fucking permission kind of tactics. And I think that, like, organizing with the Dyke March this summer and being successful to pushing back TERFs with brute force is one tactic of many in a toolkit. And I think that having exclusive politics around community organizing is problematic at best, and it should be talked about in our community, where we have all the streams get to the ocean, and not like, we're just not going to talk about those other people because they have cardboard guillotines or some kind of nonsense like that. Like, these straw man arguments about how people's intentions is problematic at best, because how do you know? You're just going to make assumptions about what people's intentions are. So it works on all sides. But in that regard, like, we were successful. We didn't ask the police for help. We didn't ask the state for help. Like a trans person who cannot defend themselves from violent attacks, are you gonna, the police are not, what's gonna happen when the police show up when you're dead, right? So I think that there's a lot of conversations that should be had in our community about building capacity with our own trans community, about being more diverse in how you live your life and how you're going to defend yourself and the things that you need to do to keep yourself safe in our community, than calling the police or relying on some policy from the colonial government of Canada. These conversations, I think, are just so vital, and I've seen them specifically targeted to be silenced in our community, and I'm really getting pissed off at that. SFU, UBC, the government, on and on and on. Like, top-heavy institutions continue to silence radical activists in our community, and that's wrong.
I also wanted to, on the conversation about colonization, thinking about the framing of this talk about how is there an export of hate from Canada, and I would say it's actually the reverse. I think we forget, like, actually colonization happened here, and where did it come from? So actually we need to, like, step back and zoom out a bit more and say, how is the impact of exporting hate from the UK reverberated back to the UK? And I think it's not an accident that Megan Murphy and lots of other famous TERFs love to tour other Commonwealth English-speaking countries. So New Zealand, Australia, UK, Canada, and also America. I think it's very telling, and it's part of a bigger narrative of trying to unpack and understand colonization and all the different oppressions that came when contact happened, and it's still ongoing today. And so and I think it's also important in this that we're implicated as well. Like, we're not separate from the TERFs, we're not separate from the cis supremacists or the white supremacists. We're a part of this mix as well, and we also perpetuate problematic things in our own communities and in our own lives. And I think that one of the strongest things is to also look at what can we change literally in our own lives to really practice what we preach and really practice the politics that we're trying to build in our own communities. And that includes also like being able to move away from this idea of respectability and respectability politics, that we have to look a certain way and then they'll, you know, maybe give us what we're asking for. And I think, like what Tammy said, it's about a whole swath of different options based on where the positions that you're in, and the timing and the context and everything. And what I've learned a lot over the last 10 months is that, you know, you can do it all. Like we tried policy writing about BPL and that didn't really go far. And we tried like just showing up and being like, rah, 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 like just don't hurt us. And then I think what really showed success was like scaring people and not even having to follow through. Like just existing and like was enough. And I think there's lots of learning from what's been happening here locally. And also I think there's a lot to be learned from the UK as well. And I'm curious about Australia now and New Zealand and what folks are doing down there, because there's stuff happening. Megan Murphy's also there too.
Would you care to respond or comment?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we should just end there. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's that, I think when there is such a central thing that you're collectively fighting, it does a number of things. It both unifies and it breaks. And you're absolutely right when you stand back from this. This is all about colonization fundamentally. It absolutely is, and it all comes back to eugenics and the extraction of wealth globally for Northern European powers like the UK, Netherlands, Belgium, etc., etc., etc. That we're still living with the legacy of today, and that is bound up with this. It binds our oppression across class, race, gender, sexuality, etc., etc. Like this is all ultimately about the legacy of colonized peoples, which is also what I find so affronting about white feminists using this argument of a singular experience of womanhood and the erasure of all the BIPOC activism of the last many decades to fight for an understanding of a multitude of experiences of womanhood that's completely erased in this conversation about there being one way to be a woman. I also completely agree with you about diversity of expression, diversity of tactics. I think that's what makes a movement, that's what makes us powerful, and we have to be better at supporting each other and at supporting our expressions of righteous anger and rage and hurt, and also challenging each other to be smart and to be smart together, and have some kind of understanding of that we're all heading towards the same problem. We don't have to like each other, we don't have to appreciate each other's way of doing things, but we are in it together. And if we start tearing each other down, then all we're doing is tearing down our own momentum. And that doesn't help either. So I just, yeah, +1.
I totally agree that we focus on specific issues. Like here we are talking about, trans antagonism going in a certain direction. It came here first. It's absolutely true. I absolutely agree that when we're focusing in a silo and we don't look at the greater issues, then we don't resolve the ecosystem, and that the ecosystem is sick, not just that one symptom of the ecosystem. On the political versus direct action side, I think politicians are the thorn in the side of direct action. Direct action is the thorn in the side of politics. Often, we speak different languages and have different outcomes and results. It's inevitable that people who are working within the lines, whatever those lines are, have to stay within the lines. And the people who are not working within the lines or making that part of their advocacy have to stay outside of the lines. And it doesn't mean that dialogue and some collaboration isn't possible or encouraged, but it does mean that sometimes, some people do say things that other people just can't touch. And there's just like no way around that. that's just how it is, you know, like if you elect someone into a body and that person has said, you know, violent things that can be held against them, then they will be very promptly unelected, and all of the work to get them there will have been wasted. And there's a value to having that person there. There's also a value to hold our systems and our systems enforcers accountable. You know, there's a lot of rage about the police. You know, the last transphobic incident, the last complaint of a violent transphobic incident by Vancouver police that I fielded directly happened in 2018. Not that long ago, right? Have there been none since then? I doubt it. And it was an unprovoked, you know, violent handling of a trans guy who got beat up by a cop who didn't like the look of him. Nonetheless, we sometimes forget that the cops are simply the embodiment of society's attitudes, right? They're the thugs that society trains, or they're the people who the society trains to do thuggish things, and those thuggish things sometimes get used against people that they shouldn't be used against. Not because the cops are bad necessarily, whether they're bad or not individually, I don't know, but it's because society tolerates it or encourages it or demands it even. And that's like a problem that we don't talk about enough, that we use society to harm others with the tools of our society and the systems of our society because we allow the dogs loose and we don't manage them, thinking about what are we not seeing that we're not aware of, because we're comfortable with our assumptions. And less assumptions is the way forward. I agree entirely.
We are just slightly over time, but there's one more voice that would like to come in, so I'm just going to, if you have to leave, we understand, but, and they seem to have switched the heating off, but just one more question.
So I want to talk about policy and what gives spaces to Morgane Murphy's, such as what happened at the Vancouver Public Library, UBC. In fact, UBC invited an Islamophobic speaker with a free speech club, so what is the whole notion of free speech? And now we have SFU, you know, inviting Morgane Murphy and then blaming trans activists for security threat for canceling it. So how do we change this policy and how do we deal with these spaces that give these people space?
So I'm going to start with a plug for the Morgane Oger Foundation fundraising page, ogerfoundation.ca/donate. And the reason why I do that is because the kind of change that you're talking about costs money. It costs money in getting people to show up in a place to make a complaint or things like that. And that stuff just costs cash, and cash has to be given by people who believe in what's being done. So Morgane Murphy and the others who incite others to discriminate on prohibited grounds are not actually breaking the law unless they incite violence. They're not actually breaking the law, which is awful, I know. But I believe that Vancouver Public Library and SFU and Toronto Public Library may have been breaking the law by participating in allowing someone to incite hatred or discrimination on prohibited grounds, because they are government institutions, they are a part of the government, and the government is required under the charter, because government institutions must live up to the charter, whereas people don't, because it's the laws. I believe that a case can be made that we can hold the institutions accountable for participating in inciting discrimination on prohibited grounds or hatred, or both together based on the legal definitions. But to do that, that's a 5 to 10 year exercise to get through to the Supreme Court of Canada, where it is certain to go, and it requires, you know, sophisticated means of the system and the machine, and that requires money. And so we can complain until we're blue in the face, but until a court decides that indeed government is responsible for what is said on its watch, we are stuck with the precedent, and today the precedent doesn't say that. The precedent says, nah, you know, worse than that, you know, we're allowing individuals to tell us to do terrible things. The chief librarian of the Vancouver Public Library told me in a one-on-one that the only way Meghan Murphy could be stopped, were someone to stop it, was if enough violence was threatened, and if enough violence was threatened, it would make it too expensive to do it. And that is like not okay, right? Because, and as I told the chief librarian, you're asking trans people to justify anti-trans propaganda by acting violent-like, right? And dangerous-like, which will confirm the trope that we are dangerous, violent people. And essentially, you know, this institution, which is the patriarchy itself, you could say, you know, has people running it that are comfortable with still demanding that it's the vulnerable people that go and put themselves at risk to do the job that they were actually hired to do. And the same thing happened at Toronto Public Library. Effectively, the same thing happened with University of British Columbia and with SFU. The only way to get events not hosted at public institutions is to basically make it too expensive with security, and that's awful, and it shouldn't be like that. The way it should be is people should be held accountable for inciting hatred or discrimination on prohibited grounds, no matter who the target is, no matter how cozy they are. And to close it off, I will point out that what Bill Watcott was fined $55,000 by the BC Human Rights Tribunal for doing, Meghan Murphy and Carrie Simpson and a number of other people in Canada are doing exactly the same thing. But they are doing it on social media, and they're doing it in person, and therefore we can't stop them, and we can't prevent them from doing it. Now there's a law being proposed. There's some ideas of a law at the federal level to bring in a new consequence for online hatred. I recommend people who are Canadians to look into it, to contribute to the conversation, to see how we frame it. I personally think that given the fact that our ISPs know our identities, we should be able to do a fine system, maybe something like a parking ticket equivalent for some sort of a threshold for misbehavior where you get a fine. You go too far, you get a fine, but there's a problem of, the big brother fears in these things, and this has to be thought through, but something like that I think would be very effective at handling anonymous hate propaganda or people spreading hate and getting away with it because there's no law at all.
Is there a number for this law or like a cost?
No, it's not framed as a law. It's not a bill yet. It's being discussed. A report from the House of Commons Justice and Human Rights Standing Committee. It's the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights puts out a report every parliamentary session, and the last report was a report on online hate, and they had 6 recommendations of what the lawmakers should consider when framing the law itself. And I think that all of us have a vested interest in something being done to handle online hatred because it harms us all, and I don't think we can keep on getting worse with this. We have to rein it in.
Close this down. George, do you want to say last few
I
words?
have a sensation very familiar to trans people, which is a near bursting bladder, so please do.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
Right out that door.
Yes. Please join me in thanking our speakers today. Thank you to all of you for keeping this a safe environment for everybody. Thank you.
Thank SFU
Or
making us excellent.
thank you for this collaboration. I don't know how to switch this off. Is this on still?
Thank you for booking me.